Hey there, this is Ari Whitten. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Today I have with me Cyrus Kambata and Robby Barbaro, which are cool names, by the way, guys, who are the co-founders of Mastering Diabetes, a coaching program that teaches people how to reverse insulin resistance via low-fat, plant-based, whole food nutrition. Cyrus has been living with type 1 diabetes since 2002 and has an undergraduate degree from Stanford University and a PhD in nutritional biochemistry from UC Berkeley. Robby was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2000 and has been living a plant-based lifestyle since 2006. He worked at Forks Over Knives for 6 years and earned a master's in public health in 2019. So welcome, guys. Nice to see you again after you interviewed me the last time we chatted a few weeks ago.
The interview was mind-blowing. People are going to want to check that one out.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes.
Yeah, and I also just became like an instant super fan of you. I was like, we got off the conversation. I was like, can we be best friends with Ari? Is that possible?
Totally. Yes, it is. But Cyrus, as we were chatting about before this, since you live in Costa Rica, you'll have to start surfing. That's the condition I have.
That's the condition? Okay. Okay. I'm in.
Think about it. Think about it.
I know. That's a hard sell, let me tell you.
I think that's a no-brainer, Cyrus. You can do that.
I know. All right, fine.
So, guys, I know you have a very personal history of why you got into doing this thing, this mastering diabetes thing. What is the personal stories or personal stories behind mastering diabetes?
So I was personally diagnosed with type 1, just like you said, in 2000. So closing in on 30 or 20 years now, living with type 1 diabetes. So the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes is that my pancreas does not secrete sufficient quantities of insulin. My beta cells have been damaged, and I now need to inject insulin in order to eat food to stay alive. So that's insulin-dependent diabetes, whereas type 2 is mainly characterized by people who produce too much insulin. Okay, insulin resistance is the cause of that condition, and we'll go into that in more detail today. But I'm living with type 1 diabetes, so of course, you start Googling and reading books and learning how can you take best care of yourself? How can you reduce the long-term complications? How do you get your best A1C? How do you make your blood glucose not a roller coaster? Because quite frankly, managing your blood glucose is quite difficult. I mean, Ari, your pancreas is working perfectly, okay? All day long, it's producing a little bit of insulin, keeping you in check. You eat meals, it's got phase 1 insulin ready to fire. You need more insulin, your body produces it and keeps your blood glucose under fantastic control.
That's the sweetest compliment anyone has ever paid. Pancreas is just beautiful.
You got
absolutely. So trying to do that manually, it's not actually the easiest thing ever, but there's things you can do to make that a much more fluid and graceful process. So you know, anybody living with type 1, you start learning. And I tried many different diets over the years, and I suffered with a lot of, regular issues that many people struggle with. I had chronic allergies. I would take Nasonex, Claritin D year round, still get sick all the time. I had terrible acne as a teenager. I took all the drugs you could take, eventually taking Accutane, which is one of the most serious drugs you can possibly take, and it has a lot of side effects. I had plantar fasciitis. I had warts on my feet. I just had these typical problems. And so I've continued to do more research and learn. And eventually I tried, low carbohydrate nutrition. I tried a sort of a Weston A. Price Foundation style thing. And none of those diets really improved my diabetes control. Okay. Eventually I ended up trying a low carb, like a plant-based ketogenic diet. So on this diet, I'm eating lots of olive oil, lots of nuts and seeds, lots of greens, okay? Very, very simple diet. And my carbohydrate to insulin ratio was 3:1. So for every single gram of carbohydrate I would eat, I would inject, for every 3 grams, I would inject 1 unit of insulin, okay? So this is a good indicator of insulin sensitivity. It's a great way to measure how insulin sensitive somebody is, all right? So as I did that, the major problem I had, other than being, that's not a good ratio, okay? That's very poor, all right? Trust me, Ari, you're much more insulin sensitive, okay? Second compliment for you. Pancreas is working fine, and you're more insulin sensitive than that.
Tell me more about my internal organs.
I will. So basically, at that point, I was doing this diet. I'm a student at the University of Florida, a freshman, And I basically ran out I just had no energy. I was really struggling. So I needed the energy blueprint at that point in my life. And I didn't have access to it. So I continued to search for more answers. And eventually I came across the idea of low-fat, plant-based, whole food nutrition. And that is when I started eating lots of fruit, lots of greens, lots of vegetables, okay? And in a short period of time, my insulin sensitivity went up and up and up to a point where I can now eat 22 grams of carbohydrate for every 1 unit of insulin. So this is a 600% change in insulin sensitivity. I've actually recently seen it go even higher than that. But the point is, people living with type 1 diabetes, myself, Cyrus, and millions of others, we are excellent test subjects of what lifestyle behaviors result in insulin sensitivity or leading towards insulin resistance, because we know exactly how much insulin our body requires. We count the carbohydrates that we consume, and we measure our blood glucose levels all day long. So many of us wear continuous glucose monitors where we can see our blood glucose every 5 minutes ping to our phone. So I know my blood glucose profile all throughout the day, and that can give you your time in range, and it can give you your predicted A1C. It's just a lot of data. You don't know. This is one thing you don't know, Ari. I know I'm trying not to keep the confidence high here, but
you're going to say a negative thing about my brain.
So you don't know how much insulin you produce on a meal by meal basis.
Fair enough.
Okay?
Fair enough.
You can't quantify, did I become more insulin sensitive, more insulin resistant in the past couple of days based on my lifestyle? You just didn't know for sure. You'd have to go into a laboratory. We'd have to do some serious testing.
Right.
Cyrus and I, we know meal by meal by meal. So that was a fascinating insight when I saw this transformation. Then my plantar fasciitis went away. The warts on my feet went away. I do not get sick. I don't take any Nasonex or Claritin D anymore. My skin cleared up. All these amazing transformations occurred. And I started looking to more of the research. Okay, what's going on here? Why is insulin sensitivity a big deal? Okay. And the key insight I had, this is in college, is I realized that what I was experiencing in my own body was this solution to prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, which is affecting over 115 million people in the US alone right now. So by demonstrating the concept of reversing insulin resistance in my own body, we can extrapolate that to say, wait a minute, this same thing, this same behavior, this same lifestyle decisions is literally the solution, reversing prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And this has been documented in the research dating back to the 1920s.
Yeah.
So that's my story of how I got into this and how we became like, okay, wait a minute, it's mastering diabetes. It's not just type 1 diabetes. It's this whole picture of how insulin resistance is affecting all forms of diabetes.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. Well, I definitely want to dig into that last bit there, but Cyrus, do you want to talk about your background and how you got into this, your personal story first?
Yeah, for sure. So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes similar to Robby, except I got it at the age of 22. So that's pretty late for a type 1 diagnosis. Normally you get diagnosed when you're like 6 or 10 or 12. But there's a growing number of people now in today's world that are getting it in their 20s, their 30s, their 50s, their 60s. And I just happen to be one of those people. So I'm a happy-go-lucky senior in college. I'm trying to graduate, move on with my life. And all of a sudden I find myself really thirsty, very low energy, and cramping every single time I would try to go to sleep. You know, that type of cramping where like you go to sleep and all of a sudden your hamstring cramps and it's like really intense. So you try and like manipulate your body so that hamstring cramp goes away. So imagine doing that. And then by trying to relieve that, now you get a cramp on the other side. Now all of a sudden your quad cramps on that side, and then your ab cramps, and then your shoulder cramps. Before I knew it, there were days where I was literally lying in bed and it was like full body rigor mortis because I was like, oh my God, what is happening to me right now? So I picked up the phone, I called my sister, and I explained my symptomology to her because she's a doctor of osteopathy and she's very smart. So she started crying immediately. She said, Cyrus, everything you're telling me is type 1 diabetes, go straight to the health center. And I remember talking to her at the time. I was like, Shanaz, I don't have diabetes. Are you kidding me? I'm like, I'm normal weight. I'm an active guy. I eat well. How do I have diabetes? And she's like, I don't have time to explain, but trust me, you have diabetes. At that time, all I thought was that diabetes had something to do with old people and cake. That's it. Right? And so here I am being like, come on, this is ridiculous. My sister doesn't know what she's talking about. Go to the health center. They measure my blood glucose. I'm at a 600, just a little bit over 600, which is 6 times higher than your blood glucose is supposed to be. It's supposed to be somewhere between 80 and 130 all day long. I'm 6 times off of that. They take me to the hospital. They start injecting insulin. They start giving me saline. I become hydrated. My blood glucose starts to come down using insulin. 24 hours later, I get discharged from the hospital with a prescription for 2 types of insulin, a blood glucose meter, test strips, a carbohydrate counting guide, and a bracelet that I have to wear that basically says, hey, I'm a life alert patient. I have a chronic disease. If something happens to me, call this phone number.
Yeah.
So that took a toll on me mentally and physically. And for the first year of my life, I was really sort of, I didn't understand why it was happening to me. What did I do wrong? You know, can I fix this? Can I reverse it? So all these questions were circling through my head. So I listened to the advice of the doctors, and the doctors basically said, listen, the only way to do this is to eat a low carbohydrate diet, because your blood glucose is going to fluctuate depending on how many grams of carbohydrate you eat per day. So think about it this way. Think about it as though you're almost like allergic to carbohydrate-rich food now, right? And that goes for breads, cereals, pastas, cookies, crackers, waffles, things like that, but also for fruits and potatoes and starchy vegetables and whole grains. So they're like, try to minimize all those foods and try to eat more meat, cheese, chicken, fish, oil, you name it. So I was like, great, I can do that. That doesn't sound hard. So I tried doing that for the first year, and it was supposed to make my glucose more controllable. It did the opposite. My glucose was all over the place. On any given day, my blood glucose would fluctuate between a 40 and a 340. It's just like back and forth, back and forth. And so after about a year, I decided that there's got to be a better way. So I started doing some research, and I just happened to come across this idea of eating a plant-based diet. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want to eat a plant-based diet. I literally just was like, the universe presented it for me. So I said, okay, great. Let me learn something about this. And under the supervision of the same guy that taught Robby, his name is Dr. Doug Graham, he taught me how to transition to a, high carbohydrate, low fat diet. In the process of doing that, my glucose instantly, I kid you not, within 24 hours of starting to eat this way, my blood glucose became much more controllable. It was much more stable. My insulin use fell by 10%, then 15%, then 30%. By the 1 week, I had cut my insulin use by 40%. I had more energy. I was not cramping anymore. I was able to go return to playing sports and playing sports hard, just like the way I like to do it. And I was like, this is like, what is going on here? This is fascinating. I want to learn more. So I put myself back to graduate school. I went and got a PhD in nutritional biochemistry so that I could understand the nitty gritty details of like what's actually happening inside of my liver, my pancreas, my muscle, my brain. Because I wanted to understand.
You started the degree in nutritional biochemistry after you had already gone vegan and started fixing your diabetes.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because and I decided to do it that way because I was so fascinated by what was happening to me that I wanted to basically understand. I literally went there with one question, which was, am I a freak of nature? Because I've never heard of anybody that's gone through this transition before. And if it was applicable to the general population, then how come nobody's told me about it before? This seems weird that I would just be learning it because I had to, right? So in this process, as I started learning more, just like Robby was saying, I started to uncover this whole body of research that about diabetes, insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, and this whole body of research, I mean, is unbelievably expansive. It goes back to the 1920s, almost 100 years at this point. And as I read more and more and more, it was literally like I was reading the science of what I had personally experienced. And so that was very exciting to me. So in the same way that you get lost in research and you sit there and you read and read and read to get to the truth, I was doing the same thing. And over the course of 5 years, I got to a point where I started to understand the research basis of insulin sensitivity and how to actually manipulate your glucose to your advantage using a very specific dietary pattern. And here we are, now trying to take that complex scientific information and translate it for people that don't know how to read science or don't care, right? So we're trying to sort of bring it to the masses to teach people that, yeah, if you live with type 1 diabetes, sure, you can experience what Robby and I have experienced. But it's also applicable to you if you're living with pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Oh, and hey, by the way, it's also applicable to you if you don't even have diabetes. And that's where I think the true magic of this message really lies.
Gotcha. So first of all, very intense personal stories, guys. I want to segue into that last bit that you mentioned there, which is type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. So these are obviously totally different conditions with different sets of causal factors.
Correct.
Yet in your approach, you're kind of using this particular approach for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
That's right.
So I just want, maybe you can first explain for people who don't really understand all the nuances, what the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes are in terms of, the mechanisms as well as the causal factors, and then why it is that you feel your approach works equally well for both.
For sure. Okay. So the simplest way to think about it is that type 1 diabetes is usually referred to as like a juvenile onset diabetes. That's the sort of classical way that people refer to it. That's no longer necessarily true because people are now getting type 1 diabetes over the course of time, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. But type 1 diabetes at its root is an autoimmune condition. And what that means is that your own immune system has been coerced and tricked into believing that specific proteins on the outside of your beta cells in your pancreas are a threat to you. And as a result of that, your immune system then goes and it attacks those cells and it kills those cells, thus crippling your ability to manufacture insulin. The reason that your immune system got tricked in the first place, nobody really knows the answer to that, but there's many different things that could be tricking your immune system. It has to deal with very specific types of protein in the foods that you're eating, the quality of the food that you eat, whether you're susceptible to certain types of viruses, and the list goes on. But the idea here is that type 1 diabetes at its root is an autoimmune condition where your immune system is actually the one that's crippling your ability to secrete insulin. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, okay, type 2 diabetes is the type of diabetes that is generally thought of as what happens later in life in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, and usually what happens to people who are overweight. Okay, now type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle condition. It's a condition that you literally eat and live your way into. Okay, some people have a very strong genetic predisposition towards type 2 diabetes, but the overwhelming majority of people are eating a diet that is actually high in fat with excess calories, especially high in saturated fat, and they likely don't exercise and they may be slightly overweight. And as a result of living with that lifestyle that then leads to a whole collection of metabolic issues, this thing called insulin resistance begins to develop. And insulin resistance is basically the precursor condition that then progresses to prediabetes and then progresses to type 2 diabetes. And insulin resistance is really sort of, you can think of it as being a condition that's caused by a diet that is high in saturated fat. And those saturated fat molecules, what they end up doing is they end up going into your adipose tissue, your fat tissue, which is stored all throughout your body. But it also goes directly into your muscle and directly into your liver. And over the course of time, as your muscle and liver accumulate saturated fat beyond their storage capabilities, then they institute this process known as insulin resistance to try and block more energy from coming into the tissue. So it's almost like you've eaten yourself into a state of very high energy over nutrition, and the tissues are now basically saying, hold on, let's try and block more energy from coming in. And the easiest way to block more energy from coming into a tissue is to tell insulin to go away. So they create this state of insulin resistance, which basically means that when you eat anything that's carbohydrate rich, like a banana or a bowl of quinoa, after you developed insulin resistance, then the glucose from that food tries to get inside of the muscle and tries to get inside of the liver. Insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, knock, knock, I got this glucose molecule. Would you like to take it up? And both of those tissues respond by saying, no, 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 no. I don't have the space for this right now. There's all this saturated fat that's accumulated inside of me. I got to get rid of this stuff first. So as a result of that, people who develop insulin resistance end up with a large amount of lipid inside of their blood. So they end up with higher circulating triglycerides, sometimes higher cholesterol values. And then they also end up with insulin and glucose that's trapped inside of their blood. So as a result of this, they end up, their blood glucose begins to rise over the course of time. And when that happens over months to years, they end up developing this thing called type 2 diabetes, which can get to a point where your glucose is so elevated that you have to make some severe lifestyle changes in order to reverse yourself back to a non-diabetic state.
Gotcha. So this presentation that you just gave as far as the causal factors and mechanisms behind type 2 diabetes, is very different than what most people would expect to hear from a lot of the low carb and keto, diet authors and advocates that are out there right now.
Yep.
And their narrative very much focuses on diabetes being a disease of high blood sugar caused by carbohydrate. Your narrative, your presentation here is about focusing on this intracellular triglyceride, intracellular fat that's there.
Exactly right.
As the causal factor. So how do we square these two things? And these are two, I would say, pretty diametrically opposed narratives on what the causal factor of type 2 diabetes is, or the main primary causal factor, and thus the main way of treating it, obviously, from that paradigm differs dramatically between your approach and their approach. So why do you think you are right and they are wrong?
Okay, somebody's done their homework. This is a phenomenal question. This is actually the root. This is the thing that's the most confusing in our world today.
And first off, before Cyrus goes into this, I just want to say, we don't think this, it's not right or wrong, okay? It's like, we have a lot of respect for all these people you're talking about. We have a lot of friends who do complete opposite approach to us. That's their choice. That's what they want. That's their lifestyle. And it's not really like, hey, we're right and you're wrong. I'm like, you know what I mean? It's just kind of like, here's information, here's science.
Those are my words, right and wrong. I'm just trying to start trouble.
Yeah, for sure. I just want everybody to know where we're coming from. So go ahead.
Okay, so Robby's wrong. I'm right. Okay, let's start there. Okay. So in order to fully really wrap your head around how is it that these two guys are telling me that a low-fat diet is actually the solution to insulin resistance versus the other side, which is telling me that a diet that's low in sugar or low in carbohydrates is actually the solution. Okay, so the first question that I would ask would be this. If we're going to talk about reversing diabetes and reversing insulin resistance, we got to ask ourselves, what does that mean? Okay, how would you know that you have reversed diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or reversed insulin resistance completely? Okay, and it's a tough question to answer, because if I were to go ask people on the low carbohydrate side of things, they might give me one answer. If I were to ask people on the low fat side of things, they might give me a slightly different answer. Okay, but
what answer would you get from just a run-of-the-mill endocrinologist who treats diabetes, who is not an advocate of any particular diet?
Okay, that's a great question. I think what they would say is well, in order to reverse type 2 diabetes, you have to drop your A1C value. Your A1C is just like a blood test that you can get that gives you a general indicator of your average blood glucose. And so they would say, we got to get your A1C value to less than 5.7%. And if your A1C value is less than 5.7%, then that means that you're living free of any form of diabetes. You don't have pre-diabetes, you don't have type 2 diabetes, and you're in the safe zone, problem solved. In addition to that, they would likely say, we got to get your fasting blood glucose to under 100. And if you do the two of those things and you're able to maintain that over time, then technically you have quote unquote reversed type 2 diabetes. Now, if you ask people on the low carbohydrate side of things, what does it mean to reverse pre-diabetes and insulin resistance? They might tell you something very similar. They would say, get your A1C value to less than 5.7%, get your fasting blood glucose to less than 100, and they might also tell you to get your fasting insulin to something less than 5. Okay, there's a different set of units associated with that. Okay, and
so what's wrong with that? I assume that you prefer a different definition. So what's wrong with that way of defining reversing diabetes?
Okay, so the thing that's missing in this equation is that both of those indicators are a very good metrics of what's happening to your overall health, but they don't take into consideration what is happening when you eat a meal. Okay, so if I'm going to measure anything about you in the fasted state, effectively what I'm measuring is what's happening to your body as a result of not eating food for something like 8 to 12 hours. Okay, I can measure anything in the fasted state, and I would get a good indicator of, let's say, what's your testosterone level after 8 to 12 hours of fasting? What's your insulin level? What's your hemoglobin level? You name it. And there's a certain utility to understanding what's happening in the fasting state. But there's also a certain utility to understanding what's happening in the post-meal state or the post-prandial state. And the post-meal state is something that's not captured by an A1C value. It's not captured by a fasting insulin value. It's not captured by a fasting blood glucose value. So what I would say, if you're going to say, hey, how do you reverse type 2 diabetes? I would say, yes, I want your A1C value to be less than 5.7, just like everyone else. I want your fasting blood glucose to be less than 100. But I also want you to be able to eat a carbohydrate-rich meal and have your blood glucose not deviate beyond about 130 or 140, and then come right back down within a 2-hour window. Okay. So if you're in a low carbohydrate setting, or you're in a ketogenic setting, what a lot of these individuals and what a lot of these health professionals have experienced is that as soon as they adopt a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet, then all of a sudden their blood glucose flatlines, their A1C falls, and they get the most stable blood glucose they've ever had in their entire life. And, they start out with an A1C of, let's say, 7.4%, and then that drops to 6.6, 6.2. And then before they know it, now they have an A1C of 5.1%. They say to themselves, look at that. I solved diabetes. I don't have diabetes anymore, right? The problem is that if they were to eat a carbohydrate-rich meal, okay, I'm not talking cookies and crackers and chips. I'm talking a banana, a bowl of rice, right? Some beans or lentils. They have one single meal that's carbohydrate rich, and then they measured their blood glucose and monitored what happened over the course of the next 2 hours. They would likely find that their blood glucose goes up, and it goes up real high. It goes up 160, 180, 200, 220, 240, and then it might come back down within a 3-4 hour window. Okay. So again, what they've done is they've optimized their blood glucose control in the fasting state, and they've optimized their blood glucose control when carbohydrates are not present, but they have not optimized their blood glucose control in the fed state when carbohydrates are present. And so the real crux of this matter really boils down to what we like to educate people to do is to eat a diet and live a lifestyle that turns your liver and your muscle tissue into carbohydrate processing machines. Okay, so that's a simple way to think about it. If you live a certain lifestyle with a combination of diet, with exercise, maybe with some intermittent fasting, that enables you to be able to eat large quantities of carbohydrate energy without a significant blood glucose elevation, then what that means is that your muscle and liver are sensitive to insulin and are able to dispose of large quantities of carbohydrate and use that for energy. But if you're only able to do that in the fasting state, but you're not able to do it in the fed state, then you're sort of solving half of the problem, but missing the other half of the problem.
Well, what if they are able to do it in the fed state by sticking to, let's say, a low carb ketogenic diet? They say, I am able to maintain my postprandial, post-meal blood sugar levels if I just keep on avoiding carbohydrate. Why do you think that's not a good way of thinking about it?
Okay, so again, that's exactly what they do say. And the answer, again, is if you vilify all carbohydrate energy, saying anything that contains carbohydrate is bad for me, it's going to trigger a high blood glucose value, it's going to make me fat, it's going to make me overweight, it's going to increase my risk for chronic disease, then that's sort of one philosophy. And the truth is that we know from over 100 years of scientific research, and maybe even more than that, that carbohydrate as a type of energy, right, a specific compound of molecules or a class of compounds, is not dangerous for your brain, your liver, your kidney, you name it. Carbohydrates are required for energy. They're a type of compound that actually metabolites to glucose, and the glucose is transported all throughout your body to be used for energy by your brain, by your muscles, by your liver. So it is important to be able to metabolize carbohydrates when they are present in your food. There goes my cat. Okay, so it's very important to be able to metabolize carbohydrates when they are present in your food. If you eat a diet where you're avoiding carbohydrate energy, sure, just like you said, you can control your blood glucose with precision. And again, you're doing it in the fed state, but you're doing it where carbohydrates are minimized and or you eliminate it altogether. But again, you're actually, when you eat a low carbohydrate diet, you actually eat yourself into increasing insulin resistance. And this is the key here. You may be able to maintain a low A1C and a flatline blood glucose, and you may be excited about that result. But in the long term, as you eat yourself into more insulin resistance, your risk for other chronic diseases begins to increase over the course of time. There's plenty of research to show that people who live with more insulin resistance are at a higher risk for hypertension, They're at a higher risk for cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease and dementia. They're at a higher risk for autoimmune diseases. They're at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease, kidney failure,
but
liver disease.
But aren't those metrics based largely on fasting blood sugar and hemoglobin H1C as far as how they're assessing and defining insulin resistance? So they're saying they're not doing it based on your metric that you presented as far as postprandial, basically carb tolerance and like how somebody processes carbs after a meal. They're doing it mainly based on fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin H1C. So I'm just saying, from the perspective of like keto advocates, of which I'm not one, to be clear. I've had keto people who are low carb keto advocates on the show that I've challenged a lot and given a lot of guff to. And,
Sure.
Now I tend to be somewhere in the middle on the dietary spectrum. So now I'm interviewing you guys who are vegan,
Totally.
low fat advocates. And so I'm just trying to bring in the best arguments from that other side for the sake of discussion and debate. But I think they would argue that basically there's studies showing, for example, that if you adopt a keto diet, you can effectively lower fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin H1C, as you mentioned. So I think they would argue, well, we are effectively lowering those risk factors for those diseases that you mentioned. And I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there's a lot of literature specifically showing that post-meal carb tolerance is a good predictor of disease risk.
Okay, so you bring up a good point. I see where you're coming with this. The question is, just like you're saying, is there research that shows that a post-meal decrease in glucose tolerance is associated with increased chronic disease risk? And I believe the answer is yes. And I'm not just saying that to sort of like, toot my own horn here or anything. I can like go and dig up the actual papers, but there's a whole body of research that actually classifies what happens. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in. When you frame it like that, I agree with you. There probably is research like that, but
yes.
I guess I'm trying to draw a distinction between assessing insulin resistance that way versus hemoglobin H1C and fasting blood glucose. Like, I think in the majority of people with post-meal carb intolerance who have very, very elevated blood sugar after a carb-rich meal, in general, I think the vast majority of those people also have very high fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin H1C. I guess what I'm saying is post-meal carb intolerance in the absence of elevated hemoglobin H1C and fasting blood glucose a good predictor of long-term disease risk?
Okay, so my response to that would be, I don't think there's a sufficient amount of long-term data to answer that question. Okay, so there's a certain amount of like inference which has to happen in this thought process, right? Because like we said earlier, we know that insulin resistance is correlated with increasing chronic disease risk, right? But yet on the other side, we know that lowering your A1C value and lowering your fasting blood glucose is correlated with improved chronic disease risk or decreased chronic disease risk, right? So the ketogenic diet of these low carbohydrate diets are sort of like somewhere in the middle, because they're elevating insulin resistance, but they're decreasing A1C and fasting glucose. So you're like, well, what would happen to those people? And the truth is that when it comes to ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets, very low carbohydrate diets, there's a strong paucity of research of what happens to people over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years and beyond. And so until that body of research starts to surface, we're not going to be able to answer the question about, what happens to somebody who's just strictly avoiding carbohydrate energy and maintaining a good A1C and fasting blood glucose. But from a whole collection of research that we do know about what happens to people who accumulate excess fatty acids and triglyceride inside of their liver and inside of their muscle over the course of time that are, classically insulin resistant. There's a body of research that actually shows that form of insulin resistance it's associated with or correlated with increasing intramuscular triglyceride and increasing liver triglyceride values. Those people are at risk for many chronic diseases, including fatty liver disease, including chronic kidney disease, and including coronary artery disease. And so what our message is to people is that, yes, you might be able to get a good A1C value, you might be able to get a really good fasting blood glucose value and post-meal blood glucose value in the absence of carbohydrate-rich foods. But that's a very tunnel vision approach, because what you're doing is you're basically saying, okay, as long as I can keep my blood glucose within this very narrow band, then everything's okay. But the question really becomes, if you're eating a very high fat diet, especially if it's high saturated fat from, a significant amount of animal products over the course of time, even if your blood glucose is controlled very well, does that mean that you're at a low risk for all chronic disease? And we would argue the answer is no. And the opposite side would probably argue that yes, the answer is yes, likely to be yes, even though neither side necessarily has a large body of research to go off of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's
the
not
one thing I would really like to add here is this key distinction between the results that can be achieved on the low carbohydrate approach, which Cyrus just went over, and then this belief and just unknown fact that the exact same results, if not better, can be achieved by eating large amounts of carbohydrate-rich foods, including fruits, starchy vegetables, beans, and intact whole grains, those 4 categories. So there's this large group of people who genuinely believe if you eat more fruit, you eat more quinoa, my insulin levels are going to go up and my blood glucose levels are going to go up. And our message to the world, and what we're talking about in our summit, which you are a part of, sharing amazing information, is to just let people know, no, that's actually not true. And there's research, again, this goes back to the 1920s, but there's just this massive library of research showing people eating very high carbohydrate diets and seeing their insulin levels drop and their fasting blood glucose levels drop in journals. So, New England Journal of Medicine, 1971, Dr. Brunzell fed people a liquid sugar diet, literally sugar water with protein powder, 85% carbohydrate, 15% protein powder. And he saw that their fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin levels drop compared to the control diet. So that's processed food. When you actually do whole food, you get better results. Mm-hmm. So like Cyrus was saying, the concern we have is that people are eating themselves into a state of insulin resistance. There's really no question about that. The only question is it physiological insulin resistance? And if the low carb or ketogenic people stopped doing the low fat diet, started adding in some carbohydrate, then they could go and show that they're actually, decently insulin sensitive. But there's no questions asked. Nobody's going to argue with this if you look at the research. Which of the 2 approaches is going to result in maximum insulin sensitivity? It's going to be the low fat, plant-based whole food approach. No questions asked.
So there are a lot of people out there in the general public who are certainly not under that impression. And I think the low carb movement that has been going on for, probably 15 years at this point, something like that, has successfully basically promoted the idea to the general public that it wasn't fat that made us fat. The whole low fat movement got it all wrong. And in fact, it's carbs that cause the obesity epidemic that are the problem with diabetes. Mm-hmm. And really we need to be just avoiding carbohydrate. So, and I know you just alluded to it there, but can you speak to, basically the narrative that you guys are presenting is diametrically opposed to the commonly held belief in the general public right now. Mm-hmm. Why do you think this whole thing is just a bunch of misinformation and they've gotten it wrong?
So let me start with that first claim there. Then this is repeated over and over and over again in the low carbohydrate community. And we're just trying to share facts and just talk about the facts here. They say America tried a low-fat diet in the 70s and 80s, okay? So in the 1970s, Americans ate an average of 147 grams of fat per day, all right? In 1980, it was 162 grams. In 1990, it was 167 grams. In 2000, it was 191 grams. In 2010, it was 190 grams. America never went on a low-fat diet. So yes, by percentage of calories, there was a very small drop, a couple percentage points. But in total fat, no, it's because we ate more calories, more garbage. The diet that we're advocating, the master diabetes method, we're telling people to have no more than 30 grams of total fat per day. It's a dramatic difference.
I just want to emphasize something you said there for people who maybe didn't quite get it. The narrative in the low carb community is that everybody went low fat. We like the whole nation adopted a low fat diet, and then the trend in obesity still went up and up and up. We just kept getting fatter despite the low fat trend. And the distinction is, yes, there were experts calling for people to adopt a lower fat diet, but as you noted the data there, and I'm familiar with that data as well. The general public, there was no actual like nationwide decrease in fat intake that happened. There was no actual test of people adopting low fat diets. And as you guys have mentioned, there are a number of controlled studies where have effectively lowered people's dietary fat intake. They put them on low fat diets and achieved successfully big reductions in weight and reversal of diabetes and so on.
That's exactly right. And the same mistake is still continued to be made when it comes to comparing low-fat diet to low-fat diets to low-carbohydrate diets in recent research. But the diet they're defining as low-fat is not low-fat. It's roughly.
Yeah, this is a big deal. So go into it, Robby. This is very important.
Roughly, they're citing research where people are fed a diet somewhere between the low 20s and high 30s, maybe 35% to 23% of calories from fat, and saying that is a low-fat diet, and saying, oh, wow, the low-carbohydrate diet performed better. Well, it's because you didn't actually look at a truly low-fat diet. I mean, it's really that simple.
So what, I know you've alluded to it a bit, but what do you see as the best research that has proven the idea that low-fat diets, and I don't know to what extent you want to say low-fat vegan diets or just low-fat diets, are effective in reversing insulin resistance and diabetes? And what has led you guys to the conclusion, what evidence has led you guys to the conclusion that those diets are superior to low carb and keto diets?
Okay, so one of Robby and I's favorite studies actually happened in 1979. And this is a study that happened at Montreal University by a guy named James W. Anderson. So what James W. Anderson and his colleagues decided to do was, over the course of time, there had been previous researchers who had showed that they could improve insulin sensitivity by transitioning people to a lower fat diet. But in those studies that started in the 1920s and 30s and 50s, the individuals in those studies also lost weight. So the critics came to this, they said, okay, cool, this is interesting, but not that interesting because there's a couple of things that are changing. You're changing their diet and they're losing weight. So we don't really know if they're increasing insulin sensitivity due to weight loss or due to a reduced fat diet. So James W. Anderson came around. He said, okay, cool. Me and my colleague, Colleen Ward, we're going to figure this out. So the two of them created a study in which they took 30 people living with insulin-dependent diabetes, okay? Regardless of whether they were type 1 or type 2. They basically took, I'd say, correct me if I'm wrong, Robby, these were people with type 2 insulin-dependent diabetes.
Correct.
Right?
That's correct.
Okay. So living with type 2 diabetes, but they had begun injecting insulin in order to keep their blood glucose control. What they did in this study was they said, listen, we're going to feed you a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, but we're going to do it whereby you're not allowed to lose a single pound of weight. If you lose weight, we're just going to feed you more and keep you very weight stable. And now I want to see what's happening to your insulin sensitivity and your insulin requirements independent of weight loss. So,
and just to add to that, their fasting blood glucose was all above 200 for every single one of them. And they were on a weight maintaining control diet for 7 days, 37% of calories from fat. And then he put them on this low fat diet, which was 9% of calories from fat for 16 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to add one thing that's just been kind of alluded to a couple times through the interview, but I want to point out that there are a number of people who argue, a number of experts in the field who would argue that the primary cause of type 2 diabetes is actually excess body fat gain. Like the actual excess fat mass itself is the primary cause of the insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So this kind of experiment that you're talking about where they're intentionally preventing you from losing body fat so that they can control for that confounding variable, which we know basically essentially every type of diet that causes weight loss, from any, just pure fasting interventions to the entire spectrum of different dietary interventions. If you cause a significant amount of weight loss, basically you can reverse insulin resistance and type 2
sure.
diabetes. So the study, I just want to point out to listeners, the study that you're citing, they're controlling for that confounding variable, keeping them weight stable, and then assessing how much effect can we have on insulin sensitivity in the absence of weight loss.
That is exactly right. So Robby, you read the results of the study because you have the slides pulled up in front of you. And I think this is one of the most fascinating results I've ever seen before.
Yeah. So in 16 days, 10 of 20 people stopped using insulin. Every single person reduced their insulin requirements, no exception. Fasting and post-meal blood glucose levels decreased. And there was also a 29% drop in cholesterol. And this was in 16 days.
Wow.
So here's the crux of the argument. You take people living with type 2 diabetes who are injecting insulin to control their blood glucose. You transition them to a diet. You prevent against weight loss. Now, these individuals have been injecting insulin for, I believe, at least a year in order to get into the study. And some had been injecting insulin for many years. So they're injecting insulin to control their blood glucose. You transition them to a diet that's low in fat, and their insulin requirements fall, and some of them get off of insulin entirely in just over 2 weeks.
Wow.
That's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is just scratching the surface. I mean, it's study after study after study. Whether you want to look at Walter Kempner's work, feeding people white rice, fruit juice, and sugar, and seeing people's fasting blood glucose go down, insulin levels drop, cholesterol drop, weight drop. It's just, this is even with refined carbohydrate. And the point the research drives home is that what is being said in the low carbohydrate community that no, these foods, they make your fasting blood glucose higher, they make you secrete more insulin, is factually false, just patently false. And then also our passion for this topic just gets so much more juiced from the fact that every single day, every meal, we're injecting insulin in our own body and observing how much insulin is required to process hundreds and hundreds of grams of carbohydrate. And what we're experiencing in our own body should be absolutely impossible, according to what's being taught in the mainstream media. And it's not just us. It's thousands of thousands of clients, hundreds of type 1s by this point. We have people come to our in-person retreats, and I am not exaggerating when I say I have never seen a single exception of a person living with type 1 diabetes who begins to increase their carbohydrate content and simultaneously decrease their fat intake and not see a dramatic improvement in insulin sensitivity. Hands down, every single time. And even if you want to get technical and argue, oh, well, you increase their fiber consumption and you increase their fructose consumption. Even if you just calculate glucose, you can use software like Chronometer and you can figure out exactly how many grams of glucose are in your diet. You will objectively see, as a person living with insulin-dependent diabetes, more carbohydrate, less fat, all this glucose, your insulin sensitivity improves. Your glucose tolerance improves. And going back to some of your earlier points, there is no long-lived group of people. There's no long-term society that has ever chosen to live in a glucose intolerant state where they actually specifically had to avoid carbohydrate-rich food to maintain their blood glucose levels. That does not exist. But the long-term societies that do exist, they ate predominantly plants, plenty of glucose was in their diet, and they were glucose tolerant. There was different percentages of calories from fat, but none of them were completely trying to avoid this food group.
Mm-hmm. So one other question I have, to get really practical is what exactly is it as far as the specific dietary pattern that you guys recommend? So maybe actually to get even more practical, maybe you guys can talk about what you've eaten so far today or yesterday.
For sure. Okay. So we put things into like a pretty simple green light, yellow light, red light, traffic light system. And we, in the green light category, we advocate eating fruits of any shape, color, size, starchy vegetables that come from the ground, like potatoes, yams, corn, sweet potatoes. We put corn in that category, even though it's technically a grain. Then we also talking about, fruits, starchy vegetables, whole grains, and then legumes like beans, peas, and lentils. Okay. And then in addition to that, we have non-starchy vegetables and green leafy vegetables as well as mushrooms. But the idea is that these are carbohydrate-rich foods that are, minimally processed or require zero processing. They're in the green light category. The yellow light category tends to have things like nuts, seeds, avocados, coconuts. These are higher fat plant-based foods that we absolutely say, you can eat these foods, no question, but we're just trying to educate people that a little bit goes a long way. So if you're going to put them into your diet, it's totally fine, but just try not to overeat on them, because if you do, then you can trigger your blood glucose to start increasing over time. And then in the red light category, we have, mainly animal-based products, because again, the research shows that people who eat more animal-based foods are at higher risk for development of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And they tend to be slightly higher in fat, which actually causes blood glucose elevations in the postprandial state. Red meat, white meat, fish, chicken. We put olive oil into this category, coconut oil as well, because these are pure fats. And then we put eggs and dairy products in that category as well. Okay. So to answer the question, Robby, what did you eat today?
Okay. So
give Ari an idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this game. So I'm very diligent about entering my food intake into an app called Chronometer, so I can calculate the carbohydrate content very diligently, so I can figure out how much insulin to dose. All right. So that's why I put food into a nutrition app. I wouldn't encourage people to do that if they don't have to use, insulin. Just like eat food and enjoy it. So this morning I had papayas, bananas, lettuce, and arugula. That was my breakfast. And this meal was 123 grams of carbohydrate, which is actually a lower amount. Usually it's a little bit higher. So that's breakfast. Lunch, I had cherimoya, I had white sapote, and I had arugula. That was my lunch. That was like 100.
What was the last thing?
Arugula.
Oh, arugula. Okay.
Yeah.
I think you said uravu. I was like,
yeah. So
some kind of exotic fruit I've never heard of.
So, if anybody's curious to see this stuff and really look into the data, on my Instagram story every day, I'm taking pictures of what I eat, and I've saved several days in my highlight so people can see exactly what I'm eating, exactly how much insulin I'm injecting, and my blood glucose levels. So I have the CGM data. You can see the average blood glucose throughout the day. You can see my time in range, which is a specific metric for people living with type 1 diabetes. And my numbers are far better than what people could ever imagine possible. So the average type 1, their time in range is maybe somewhere between 50 and 70%. I spend 90% of my time in range. And I use a physiologically normal amount of insulin. Somewhere between 25 and 50 units of insulin is what my pancreas would secrete if I did not have damaged beta cells. So as a person living with type 1 diabetes, you want to find a way to live a lifestyle, to eat a diet and move your body in a way where you're only injecting what your pancreas would have normally physiologically produced. So I'm doing that, eating 600, 700, 800 grams of total carbohydrate per day. And it shouldn't work out. It shouldn't make sense. But when you go and look at the research, you understand why it actually works out.
What did you say what you had for dinner as well?
Well, I haven't eaten dinner yet, but
like yesterday.
Yesterday. I'll tell you what. Let's see. Yesterday dinner was lettuce, pomegranate, mangoes, carrots, and red bell pepper.
So it's basically pure fruits and vegetables. I mean, no even nuts and seeds. I mean, obviously you guys have thought a lot about diet, but I'm wondering to what extent you're worried about a protein deficiency, what extent you're worried about B12 deficiency, which I'm under the impression something like 90% of vegans are deficient in B12, zinc deficiency, DHA, EPA, things like that. To what extent are you worried about those issues? I mean, I assume you're not worried about them, but what's the rationale for why you're not worried about them?
Okay, so this is a fantastic question. So first off, I choose to eat a much more simpler diet than we're actually recommending as the Mastering Diabetes method. It's a lot broader. So let's start there. Number two, B12 deficiency is a problem no matter what diet people are following. And we do recommend that everybody takes a B12 supplement. All right. Zinc, iodine, some of those are like nutrients of concern. And we would definitely tell people to pay attention to them. Pay attention. Again, no matter what your diet is, there could be some issues there. So especially if you take out salt, you don't have any iodine anymore, like there's things to pay attention there. But a key thing here when it comes to EPA and DHA, this is something we covered in detail in our book. The biggest problem there is people say, oh, you follow a vegan diet, you can't do the conversion. The biggest issue is that people are eating too many omega-6 fats. Okay, so it's the same enzyme, delta-6 desaturase, that's doing the conversion of both the omega-3 side and the omega-6 side. And when you have too many omega-6s, the pathway prefers to handle that path, and then the omega-3 path is left just basically not getting the conversion that needs to happen. So Cyrus and I, again, experiment N of 2, we both have had our EPA and DHA levels tested. And we are way above the norm. Cyrus, maybe you can explain the results better than I can. But we do better than people who supplement, people who eat nuts and seeds. And again, N of 2, but we encourage people to get tested. So there's a test you can use from Omega Quant, and you can see what is your EPA and DHA level inside your cell membranes. And you can decide, are you going to make lifestyle changes or are you going to supplement? So most people, like their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is 20 to 1, absurdly high. It should be 4 to 1 to 1 to 1, somewhere in that range. And that's the biggest reason of why people are struggling on that front. And then maybe they do add in some animal products, maybe they do add in a supplement and symptoms go away. It's because they did fix that nutrient deficiency, but it wasn't the diet that was the problem. It was that wasn't the source of the issue. So they didn't try another way. And again, it's such an important issue. If you are out of whack, it might be smarter to supplement and fix your diet simultaneously, but that's a personal decision for you to make with your doctor.
Mm-hmm. So how do you guys explain, and I assume you're not supplementing with omega-3, so how do you explain your personal results in terms of your own omega-3 levels, especially given that you're not consuming, and Cyrus, I don't know about your diet, but certainly Robby's not consuming lots of sources of ALA, of plant-based omega-3s that can be potentially converted into DHA and EPA. So how do you explain those results?
In short, when you eat the foods that I eat, I absolutely do consume enough ALA to do the conversion. And I'm just looking it up in our book right now. My result was 8.28%, and Cyrus was 7.11%. And this is after.
And just for context, in the general population, if you go get this Omega Quant test, anything over a 4% is considered very good. So, you want your omega-3 results to be 4% or beyond. And when we got these tests taken, we had no idea what we were going to get. I was actually expecting that I was going to be low. And then Robby came in at an 8.28. I came in at a 7.11. When we showed this to some of our colleagues, they were blown away because they said, you guys don't even eat nuts and seeds. You're not taking an algae supplement. You're not taking omega-3, a fish oil supplement. You're not taking anything to actually that is canonically considered to be high in omega-3s, but yet your omega-3 essential fatty acid status is quite high. That's impressive.
And to be clear, what do we attribute that to? And we wrote this explicitly in the book. We attribute it to our consistent, healthy ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats.
Gotcha.
As simple as that.
What about protein? So Robby, I think, based on the description of meals that you had, I'm guessing maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30 grams of protein per day is what you're getting?
Well, it's roughly 6 to 8% of calories coming from protein in my particular diet. Mm-hmm. Again, more than enough to meet your essential needs. And
I think I'm under the impression that I don't know the exact numbers offhand, but I'm remembering somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 45 is considered bare minimum, 45 grams. And then I think it goes up to around 90. If I'm sure that the specifics of the numbers I'm getting wrong, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood is considered bare minimum to meet nutritional sufficiency. I'm just guessing based on the description of the meals you had that you're not hitting those numbers.
So based on Chronometer, I am hitting the essential requirements. So okay. 40 grams. The other day was then 41. Let's see, we have another day with 77. I ate way more calories. Another day was 69.7.
So what is the rationale for protein restriction? And you gave some rationale for avoidance of animal foods, but why not consume some more plant foods that are richer in protein, even things like, let's say, spirulina or lentils or nuts and seeds, or even plant-based protein powders? What would be the rationale for avoidance of those things?
Okay, so like Robby was saying, in his particular situation, he chooses to eat a diet that's literally strictly fruits and vegetables, and that's it. fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, maybe some mushrooms. That's it. That's a personal choice on his end. What we advocate is not actually to become that sort of narrow in your dietary habits. We recommend people eating fruits, vegetables, starchy vegetables, legumes, just like you said, beans, peas, lentils, and then whole grains as well. So I used to eat similar to Robby. Over the course of time, I've diversified my food intake. So now I eat on a daily basis. I eat legumes, I eat chickpeas, I eat black beans. I'm also eating things like quinoa, I'm eating rice. And as a result of that, it's easier for me now to intake more protein than it is for Robby. So Robby's hovering around 6%, 7%. If you do the calculation, he's actually getting about 0.6 grams per kilogram body weight, right? Which is actually not in a protein deficient state by any stretch of the imagination. But when you're eating things that are a little bit more protein rich, even if you have nuts and seeds you throw in there, with legumes especially, your protein intake can go up, and it can go up dramatically. So on a daily basis, my protein intake tends to be a little bit higher than Robby's, just because I choose to eat those foods. I'm hovering somewhere between 75 and 100 grams per day. And we have people that we know of, people in our coaching program, who are eating excess of 100 grams of protein per day. But just like you said, they're coming mainly from the plant-based world, right? Full disclosure, I also take a hemp protein powder supplement, and I'm fully open with the fact that I use this. And so do we recommend
you say
everybody?
it like it's such a horrible thing to consume it?
No, the reason I say it that way actually is because in the plant-based world, I'll be totally honest with you, there's a stigma about using protein powders.
Yeah, I'm aware that I personally find it to be extremely irrational and not very grounded in evidence.
Sure. Okay. So there's some people who advocate that, getting concentrated forms of protein, even if they come from plant-based sources, can become inflammatory, which again, I'm like you, I haven't seen the data to sort of back that up. And then there's also a whole body or there's other people that are saying that the protein powders tend to actually have heavy metals inside of them, and they're not disclosed on the labels, and it's hard to know. But if you actually test them in a laboratory, then a lot of them test positive for heavy metals, right? So regardless of whether either one of those is true, the fact of the matter is I use a protein powder supplement. It works. It keeps me, feeling fantastic. It keeps me recovering really quickly from exercise.
Yeah. I just for clarity, because I personally have no problem with protein powder supplements, provided you're using a good quality supplement. I don't sell a protein powder myself, so I don't really have any vested interest here. But just to point out the heavy metals issue, a number of them have been tested, and we have an idea of which ones are higher or lower. But also, I think people don't realize a lot of times in those discussions that many sources of just like plain produce, you can find traces of heavy metals there as well. So we can't be irrational about how we assess heavy metals, like hold on to this narrative where only seafood or only protein powder are contaminated with heavy metals, but nothing else is contaminated with heavy metals. And it's like, there's traces of heavy metals in pretty much everything.
Yeah. And to be clear, our coaching program, we specifically created it to make sure that people's personal preferences and personal needs are accommodated and met. So any nutritional question, hey, I'm concerned I'm not getting enough protein. It's like, okay, let's help you tweak it. Let's look at the data in front of you. Let's see what you're eating. Let's make sure you're feeling really happy and that you're getting what you think you need or what you're looking for. Let's make it happen. So there's actually a lot of flexibility within our program to make sure people are getting the results that they want and that they're mentally really confident and happy with everything they're putting in their body.
Yeah, got it. I want to make sure that we explicitly talk about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. We've alluded to this a number of times throughout the interview you guys have. But specifically, why is it that the dietary intervention that you guys are talking about is something that works equally well for type 1 diabetes, which is, as you guys said, an autoimmune condition where the body's attacking the pancreas and preventing it from producing enough insulin or insulin at all, and type 2 diabetes, which is primarily lifestyle-induced insulin resistance, which is some combination of lifestyle factors, accumulation of excess body fat, and intracellular triglyceride, and some of the other factors you've mentioned. But why is it that this dietary intervention applies to both of those things with two radically different sets of causes?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, because The reason why it's so effective for both types of diabetes, and I'm also going to throw in gestational diabetes into the same category, is because in all situations, what a low-fat plant-based whole food diet does is it optimizes the effectiveness of insulin. Okay? And so effectively what is happening is that by eating a diet that is low in fat, that is high in carbohydrate, high in micronutrients, high in fiber, by eating that particular diet, what ends up happening is that insulin becomes more effective at every site that it elicits an action. So insulin becomes more effective inside of your muscle tissue. It becomes more effective inside of your liver, becomes more effective inside of your brain, becomes more effective inside of your kidney, your heart, your vasculature, you name it. And so because insulin becomes more effective, it is now applicable to any form of diabetes, and it is applicable to the general population at large. So you, in your particular situation, like we said earlier, you're not measuring how much insulin your pancreas is secreting on a daily basis. So to a certain extent, your insulin output is a black box to you. But if we were to measure it and we were to transition you to a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, what we would likely find is that your pancreas would have to secrete less insulin, right? So less insulin from your current baseline, and your insulin requirements would go down, even though your carbohydrate intake is going up. Okay, so to a certain extent, you would actually you would be reducing your risk for the development of insulin resistance and diabetes, because you're allowing your pancreas to perform less work to metabolize carbohydrate-rich food. Okay, so you're right in the sense that for people with insulin, with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, we're addressing their lifestyle-related issues. They've already developed insulin resistance, like we covered, and now this is a good solution for them because they're allowing their muscle and liver to become very insulin sensitive. For people with type 1 diabetes, don't necessarily have insulin resistance. But what ends up happening is that they get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes first, and then they start eating a low carbohydrate diet second, because that's the sort of canonical wisdom, and that's what the general recommendations are. So they develop type 1 diabetes, then they eat a low carbohydrate diet, which then induces an insulin resistant state. And as a result of that, by transitioning to a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, they can then recover their insulin sensitivity and watch as their insulin requirements fall as their carbohydrate tolerance increases dramatically. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. So guys, thank you so much for this interview. Thank you for hanging around for about 15 minutes extra beyond the allotted time window. I appreciate it. This has been a blast. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for playing so nice as I've stirred up drama between you and the low carb community.
Good. And I'm glad you did.
And you guys have a summit, Mastering Diabetes Summit, that is coming up. So everybody can opt in for that summit. It is 100% free. You can get access to a bunch of great talks. As they mentioned, I'm one of the speakers there as well. Woo. And it's theenergyblueprint.com/mastering diabetes. You can opt in for that. There's a bunch of great bonuses that they have for you as well. Guys, tell us about, kind of the quick and dirty on what this summit is all about.
Okay, so this is the 4th year that we're hosting this summit, and we do this annually. And what we do is we basically interview between 20 and 30 of what we consider to be some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to understanding the nuances of insulin resistance and diabetes. So we put together an interview series, and we, if you register for the summit, then every day for a 9-day period, you will be given access to 3 new speakers. And you can watch these interviews as Robby and I sort of conduct, interviews with prominent speakers, New York Times bestselling authors, prominent researchers. And we ask them some pretty darn challenging questions about their knowledge and their experience in working with people with diabetes and in understanding the science of insulin resistance and diabetes at large. And so what we've heard from people who have participated in these events is that it completely transforms the way that they think, because it's human nature to be presented with a new idea, and that new idea becomes challenging at first, right? In the same way that I'm sure a lot of your listeners right now are listening to this podcast and they're thinking to themselves, well, if what Robby and Cyrus were saying was true, how come I haven't heard about it before, right? It sounds like some made up thing that these two guys just happen to experience, but there's not a good solid research basis behind it. But then you hear it a second time, and you hear it a third time, and you hear it a fourth time, and you hear it from a different angle, and you hear multiple people talking about it, and they each give you access to more sort of subtle, nuanced information about this thing that we refer to as low-fat, plant-based, whole food nutrition. And before you know it, all of a sudden you're like, wow, there's actually much more information here than I had ever anticipated. And so that's what the whole summit is about, is to try and teach people using not just one source of information, but multiple sources of information, multiple experts, to talk about various aspects of how a plant-based diet and how achieving an optimal lifestyle can actually dramatically reduce your risk for the development of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, and make you living with type 1 or 1.5 diabetes feel like $1 million. Mm-hmm. So it's a really fun event. It's online. It's starting in January. It's going to be going live on January 15th this year of 2020. And we really hope that people get an opportunity to participate and really learn a lot from these phenomenal speakers.
Awesome. Guys, really, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for coming on the show. To everybody listening, again, you can go to theenergyblueprint.com/mastering diabetes. There'll be a link there to sign up for the summit for free. Guys, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to chat with you again in the near future. The last couple chats we've had have been awesome, so hopefully we can keep doing this year after year.
We appreciate it, Ari. This is it's been super fun for us, and thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care, guys. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.